Welcome and thank you for joining me for the fourth webinar of our digitization series. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things. This session is being recorded and is going to be available to rewatch after on our YouTube channel, and that YouTube channel is NNYLN. You will also receive the slides and the recording in an email. Anyone who's registered will get that email probably by the end of the day or tomorrow. Information presented today is a combination of my experience as a practicing archivist as well as research that I have done. If you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A section or in the chat, and I'm going to do my best to answer those either when we come to natural breaking points, or I'll also make sure to leave some room for questions at the end. For those of you who are joining for the first time, welcome. My name is Caitlin. I am the Special Collections Consultant at Northern New York Library Network. I am a North Country girl and grew up in a small town in Franklin County. I found my love of local history during my time at undergraduate, which I attended at SUNY Potsdam. And then I went on to get my master's degree in library and information science from Simmons University in Boston, and I concentrated in archives management there. Since then, I've been a practicing archivist in Massachusetts, California, and now in New York. My first job out of grad school was as a collections photographer at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, and that's really where I got my start and learned a lot about cultural heritage imaging. I've also worked as a curator and archivist at a small private historical society for a town, and as an academic archivist for a small liberal arts college in California. At both of these institutions, I was the only trained archivist on staff, and I got to wear many hats, as I'm sure most of you do. One of the many tasks that I completed at these institutions was working on digitization programs or digital programs, including starting a program from scratch. And on this slide, you can see me testing out a setup and workflow documentation with a bound ledger with our camera rig setup. Part of why I love the field so much is that I constantly get to learn new things. I like to try to stay up to date with new trends and tools by attending professional trainings. Most recently, I became a certified digital archive specialist through the Society of American Archivists, where I got to learn a lot about how to care for digital materials. As a quick recap of where we have been so far, we reviewed broad concepts of digitization and considerations of why you may or may not want to pursue it in our first webinar. In the last two webinars, so 2 and 3, we did a lot of planning and creating documentation to define our programs, their goals, selection criteria, resources that you have available at your institutions or could get your hands on easily. And we also took a look at the quality specifications that you may want to achieve. If you've missed any of these sessions, they are available on that YouTube channel I mentioned at the opening. The series has been designed for each of these sessions to build on each other so that you have a basic digitization program by the time we reach the end. Of course, you're welcome to attend as many or few as you would like. So what are we going to talk about today? Today, we are going to go over maybe the moment you've all been waiting for, actually digitizing or scanning materials. I know this is one of my favorite steps in the process. We will do a quick recap of digitization as a whole, review top priorities that we want to keep in mind while we're digitizing. We're also going to spend a lot of time reviewing examples that I put together of digitizing different types of materials. So for example, we're going to look at what I've picked categories based on what you likely have in your collections, and we're going to look at how do we handle them safely, how do we apply those specs we talked about last time, and what could a workflow look like. Don't forget all of the documentation that we have been making up until this point. We're not done with it yet. We want to use it. And all the information and decisions that we've been gathering to inform the digitization that we're doing. And we're also going to want to add to that as we talk about more decisions and workflows and things like that today. Because remember, we want that to be our step-by-step guide that someone could sit down and follow to make sure we kind of are consistent in our practices and across all of our staff and volunteers, anyone who's working on the collections. what is digitization? Scanning, imaging, reformatting, it's called a lot of different things. When we digitize something, we are taking a physical thing and we're transforming it into a digital representation. Through this process, we are creating a brand new file that we're going to add to our repositories and that we're going to need to take care of. So now when we digitize our collections, our goal is to create as accurate of a representation or likeness to the original physical object as possible. So this includes features like the object's size, its color, and other details. We want to make sure we capture that. Last time when we looked at the guidance that's put out by the field and those best practices and standards that we want to strive to align our programs with, and we want to find the balance of those guidelines with what we are capable of doing. So when we digitize, what are we making? Last time we also talked a bit about file formats and what kinds are often made and used when we do still image digitization. When we are capturing an image of that original material, we want to create that master file. So that's the high quality file that contains the most information possible. It should have little to no compression, and we're going to do very minimal editing to it. Again, our goal is to have as accurate of a representation to that original as possible. We want to try to get that in that first capture. What are you going to need to digitize? Referring back to last time, one more time, we want to consider all of those sources and the resources that you have and that you could easily get. Hopefully you have or can take some time to compare your equipment and what it can do to those quality goals you would like to achieve. If your equipment can achieve that, then great, you're all set to try to do some things in-house. Otherwise, you may keep those in mind and be able to go talk to a vendor about what you're hoping to accomplish. We will need some kind of capture device to actually take the image. You're also going to likely need some kind of capture software to talk to the device and let you control the quality settings that you have selected. So chances are this will be something running on your computer or a laptop or something. I'm not going to go into specific devices or software today because there are a lot of options at a lot of different price points. So some are definitely more expensive than others. So we're going to talk about the priorities that you should have in mind while digitizing, which then will hopefully impact what you consider using to ensure safety of your objects, things like that. So as a quick aside, before we move on to those priorities, for those of you who are members of the Northern New York Library Network, we do have a scan kit that can be borrowed. This includes all the tech that you would need to do the scanning, as well as software to work with your files during and after scanning. If this applies to you and you want to learn more about it, I've included a link in the resources slide that will get sent out in the email afterwards. You can also find some information on our website. Before we get started into talking about those examples that I mentioned, let's talk about the priorities that we want to have no matter what while we digitize. So what is really important to keep in mind throughout the process? Priority number one, which I have mentioned maybe a time or two, and I'll probably keep saying, is that material safety is always our number one priority. We never want to force materials to open, unroll, or move in any ways that they can't do. You're going to want to go slowly and pay attention to what their materials are looking like and what they feel like. And if there's any kind of question or resistance, then you're going to want to stop, reassess what's going on, maybe get some additional help or advice. So keeping those materials as safe as possible and preserving them is always our first priority. We also want to be mindful to preserve the context of our materials. So we're going to think about this in two ways. First, we want to keep the physical materials in order that they are found and housed while we digitize. So the physical materials that we're scanning are our first thing we want to keep in mind there. A very handy way to do this is, especially if you have like a box of documents or something, is if you have like a sheet of copy paper, maybe archival paper, this is going to be temporary. You can cut strips of paper, usually the long way, and to be like a flag. And you can put these in your box and you pull a folder from one side of it. When you put it back, put it in the other, and it'll act as like your placeholder. So if you move your folders from one side to the other, as you keep working through them, by the end, your flag will be at the back of the box and everything will be still in its original order that you started. So now that we've kind of thought about those physical materials and flipping them in order, refiling them in order, we also want to think about those digital files that we're creating. How are we going to keep those in the order that the physical materials are in, so that when we view those digital files, we're having the same experience and experiencing the same context that we did when we looked through the physical files. So a lot of times the easiest way to do this is with file naming. We're going to talk a lot more about file naming in the next webinar about post-production, but you may decide that you'd rather do this step while you're actually capturing your images. Since the computer can sort files by name, this is a way for us to control that order that they appear in and can keep things organized. So just as a very quick example, like I said, we'll talk more about this next time, but it can be as simple as using a numbering system to keep the materials in order. In my experience, or in my example, sorry, I have just identified what I'm calling the unique ID of the material itself, and then a number counter. So if you see the line below that and on next to the square bullet, so I used an accession number. So here's my 2024. So a donation from the first donation of this year, 2024, first donation. It's the third object of that donation. And then I have an underscore. And then, so this would be the 21st picture I took of that object. So maybe it's a bound ledger or something, maybe a scrapbook page or something like that. So this is a very easy way where I'd keep that beginning unique part because that's the material. And then that 0, 2, 1, that number counter would just count up as I keep taking images. Our third priority is going to be to create the best quality image as possible. No matter what your setup is, we all kind of have the same basic goal. We want to capture the best image that we can with the equipment and the resources that we have. So what does that mean? We want to be able to see the whole image. So if you look at the example on the right, I kind of an example I did with a scanner. I tried to make it extreme so you could see it. But the top picture, I've tried to make a lot of artifacts and things in that we don't want. And then the bottom is like our good, this is what we're looking for, scan. So what do I mean when you can see the entirety of the image? Well, we want to make sure that the edges and nothing's like cut off or missing. So in the top image, you can see that if you look at the border, there's kind of a border within the border. So the yellow internal line, you can see that that outside part is what we call skewed. So it's not square. We can tell that that line is closer on some parts than others, which means parts of that original postcard, which actually is sitting here in front of me, is actually missing. So the bottom edge on the left in this slide, or your right, there's actually part of that border is now gone. So that's not something that we want to see. Another factor that we want to think about is we want our images to be clear and in focus. So we don't want them to be fuzzy or blurry in any way. We also want to make sure that the material is parallel to that capture device. So depending on your equipment, this is very similar to seeing the entirety. So again, that's that skewing that we see on the edges. Depending on if your capture device is like an overhead scanner or even like an iPhone or something like that, it's a lot easier to have that kind of skewing happen where it doesn't look square anymore. And finally, we don't want any kind of obstruction. So this could be loose dirt, dust, maybe accidentally like a hair will fall and be on the scanner bed. So in the top example, you can see I have a circle in the middle around some dust, and that is not on the original object. So I would not want it there because, like I mentioned earlier, we want to get as close to the original object as we can, so we don't want to add extra stuff. In this example, I also introduced, you'll notice on the top, I have boxes drawn, and that's discoloration. So kind of a weird artifact that I introduced to the scanner, but you want to look for things like that while you're scanning. Our fourth priority is to be consistent in our methods. So how do we do this? That's what all that documentation that we've been starting to work on is for. We talked about the benefits of documentation last time a little bit. We want to add our decisions and the steps and the workflows that we keep developing to this documentation to serve as that guide or that how-to manual for our processes, because we really want to make sure that we're consistent so we know what has been done, which helps us care for our objects. And we want to make sure our processes are repeatable so we can get the same quality product every single time, no matter who's doing the work. So what kind of materials can we digitize? Each format has different handling and equipment requirements for digitization. They all can be a little bit unique. For our purposes today, we're going to talk about two general categories of digitization, and that is reflective and transmissive materials. So what are reflective materials? This is what we refer to as objects that the light has to bounce off the material for us to see it, or for the camera to see it in this case. We're going to look at 3 examples today that are likely in your collections. We're going to look at loose materials, bound materials, and oversized materials. And for each of these, we're going to talk about how to handle them, how we might apply those specifications that we talked about last time, and what a workflow might look like. So loose materials are often the easiest to start with for a digitization program and are most likely something that you will have capabilities to do yourself. By loose, I'm talking about an item that's only 1 page or 1 leaf, such as a single photograph, a postcard, maybe a page from a letter, something that's not attached to anything else. It's just one piece of paper or object. When handling reflective materials, so that's something that light is bouncing off of. There are 2 general rules of thumb that we want to do for handling. So if it's paper-based and doesn't have like a glossy surface, then you're just going to want to make sure you have clean and dry hands to handle it. You don't need anything extra. You don't need white gloves. I know there's a whole debate in the field about that, but a lot of the current best practices are clean and dry hands are the best. So you have dexterity to feel what you're doing and not accidentally rip something. So that is the kind of accepted common practice today for that. An exception to this guidance is if you have nail polish on, then you are going to want to wear nitrile gloves because that nail polish can transfer to materials pretty easily, even if it's dried. For photographic materials, so that kind of has more of those glossy surfaces, you are going to want to wear gloves when you handle that, no matter what. If you don't have, there's kind of 2 options. There's nitrile gloves, which you've likely seen. They come in a box, kind of look like this. Another nice option if you're doing a lot of digitization, because gloves make your hands sweat like crazy, is there are things called finger cots that you can get, and it's almost like the glove with just the finger part. You can put it on your finger, and then you can just put it on how you're holding things, and the rest of your hand is free. When picking up and handling material, you're going to want to try to pick it up from the edges and support it underneath when you're moving it, usually using 2 hands. Corners anywhere where if something is folded, sometimes the edges you want to take a look. These can kind of be more brittle areas, so you'll want to be cautious when you are working with them. And it's kind of just best practice to take a quick look at everything before you move it to identify if there's kind of places that have weaknesses or damage. that might need some extra help or support. Now, in our last webinar, we talked about those specifications, including those FADGI guidelines, the Federal Agency Digitization Guidelines Initiative, for cultural heritage imaging. And while there was a lot of information in those guidelines, we just looked at the pieces that might be able to help us and make our program a little bit stronger and a little bit better. So how do we apply those guidelines that we picked now that we actually are sitting in front of our equipment? As an example, in my digitization or documentation plan that I made, I decided that I wanted to use the specifications that are in the table on the left. And then on the right, you can see my dialog box from the scanner that I was using. And then the arrows are mapping the specifications that I picked for my institution to that scanner dialog box for me to make those, to implement those choices. So I made sure that my mode was set to color. My bits per pixel had a value of, I wanted to have it to be a value of 8. My scan resolution is set to 600 dpi because I was scanning a photograph. And I wanted to make sure I had that master file format of a TIFF while I was scanning. As a quick aside, you may have noticed and be wondering why my bits in my table are say 8, but in my dialog box it says 24. It's actually okay. It means the same thing. If you remember when we talked about color mode last time, I mentioned that there's a mode called RGB, which stands for red, green, and blue, that can combine to make millions of colors. So these are, that red, green, and blue are called color channels, and the 3 of them each can have those 8 bits. So 3 times 8 is 24. That's where that number comes from. So now that we looked at this overview of how we can choose those controls and those settings on our scanner, let's see what it might look like when we actually try to walk through a process of digitizing something. So we're gonna wanna start, these are the steps we wanna keep in mind for that step-by-step process. So we're gonna wanna make sure that we have a clean work surface when we start. Again, my example is with a scanner. This will apply to anything that you have. So you may want to use something like a microfiber cloth just to make sure you don't have any of that dust or dirt. If you're on some kind of a table surface, maybe a soft bristle brush or a manual air blower, something like this that you push the air out of. You're going to want to be very careful. If you have to use some kind of a cleaner or a spray to get off stubborn dirt from your device, you're not going to want any kind of materials, your collection materials present. And I highly recommend that you do not use them with your materials. If you do have to clean your device for some reason, make sure that the surface is really dry and kind of aired out before you put any collection materials on them. And I'll also advise you to make sure you use the manual air blower and not canned air, because they can end up accidentally discharging moisture, which you won't want near your materials. So moving on kind of to your equipment, you're going to want to make sure you set up like a folder of where you want to save your files, so you intentionally know what material it was for or what collection it was for. You're going to check that those capture settings that we just looked at in the last screen are all correct to what you're scanning. Then once you have all that kind of setup work done, you'll want to place your object on your surface. So in my scan bed, capture it, remove the object and make sure you put it back where it goes in the physical sequence. And then you're going to want to glance at your screen just to kind of check on the image, look, see if there's any kind of errors, dust, debris, anything that looks funny, in case you want to reshoot it while you have it handy. All right, moving along to bound materials. To handle, so these are the materials that have multiple pages that are connected together. So think of books, ledgers, maybe scrapbooks. So like loose materials, the handling is pretty similar, where we're just going to want to have those clean, dry hands. The trick with bound materials is that you want to assess how the objects can move or open very carefully. We never want to force them open and cause damage to their spines. Some bound materials will also already have some like weakness or damage along their spines, which could cause them to detach or come apart. So you want to very carefully kind of manipulate them to see what they can and can't do. Bound materials are usually harder to digitize in-house because the handling to keep them safe during digitization, because of how they can open or maybe not open, is more difficult. So you want to make sure that we don't squish it or force it to lay flat or cram it in a scanner, things like that. And file management is also a little bit more complicated because you have those alternating pages, and you'll see when we get to the workflow of how we shoot why that might be a little more tricky. So the number one thing with handling bound materials is that we want to make sure we support them throughout the digitization process. So you can see some examples of supports on the slide. So there's like these foam wedges, even some like rolled material in some points. So if you look at the example in the bottom left, that's a good example of what it might look like when someone's actually digitizing. They're just shooting the one side that's kind of parallel with the table, while the other side is being held up, so the book won't open beyond what it is able to. In order to kind of keep those pages level while digitizing, so we don't have that weird skewing that we talked about earlier, they use these foam supports. Sometimes there's also things that they use and that you like put in under the pages to kind of shim them to make them level. This could be things like archival board, maybe other pieces of foam. It usually is a temporary support, so sometimes even just a clean piece of cardboard or something can be used to do this. So because the equipment is more specialized to be able to capture bound materials, in compliance with those FADGI guidelines that we talked about, I'm going to skip the specifications piece for the sake of time in this example. They do have some, but like I said, this is a more complicated digitization process generally if you want to hit specifications. For bound workflows, you're going to want to start like reflective with the loose materials, make sure you have a clean and dry surface. Bound materials are often captured from overhead because we want to protect the spines of the books. So the camera is often mounted overhead, so it's some kind of like an overhead camera or scanner. There's usually three main options that I've encountered to actually capture materials, depending on what you have for setups. I mean, you can see some examples of those on the slides. So it could be something as simple as just using a camera in some kind of a device. They do make special kind of overhead scanners or book scanners. And then there's that example on the bottom of the screen that I was just talking about, how you kind of shoot one side at a time. So the options are, so the top right option would be to shoot the whole book when it's open, so both sides at the same time. This sometimes can lead to kind of distortion of your pages and things. Some equipment and software has ways to try to correct this, but remember, what we want to try to capture as accurate of a representation of that original object as possible. So depending on what the software is doing to fix those things, just pay attention to how it's making those changes and what it's doing to your image. Then we have the option like the bottom, where instead of shooting both at the same time, you shoot one side at a time. So in one case, you might just you go through the book one way, you shoot all the odd pages, then you flip it the other, then you kind of set it up and move it around the other way and shoot all the even pages. So what's really important when you do it this way is that you want to make sure your file naming is really careful, so that those files will interleave after you're done. The final option, which I don't recommend, but for completion's sake, I'll mention, is that you could do the same method that's in that bottom picture, but you could flip the book back and forth so the pages are in order as you shoot. But the problem with that is it's a lot of handling, kind of harder handling on the book. So, and it's just more cumbersome for whoever's doing digitizing. So, don't really recommend it, but it would be an option. While you're digitizing, there are also likely a few things that you should try to do to get as good of an image as possible. As I mentioned, so we don't have that weird skewing, you're going to want to try to make sure your page is as parallel to whatever's taking the picture as possible. Some things to help us do that were those that you can kind of shim the pages with maybe like archival board or foam, like I mentioned. There's also, you can get these little tiny bubble levels that you can just set on the page to check it and see you know, that can help you gauge if your page is level or not, or even if your capture device is level or not. I've also used it to make sure the table I'm working on is level. There's micro spatulas, which is what is second over from the left. That if you kind of just need another hand almost, but don't have one, you can gently set that on the edge of the page to help you hold something in place if the page is trying to like pop up on you. There's also weights. So in the middle picture, those are called snake weights. They can kind of, you can set them on the edge where there's no content, and they can help you hold things. Some other tools that can maybe help you is if you're using some kind of like a tablet or a phone, and that's how you're taking like a reference image, say, there are settings you could turn on called level and grid, which can help you square up and level your actual camera to the surface that you're working on to give you a better image. With bound materials, one other thing that you're going to want to watch out for is for shadows or obscured text. So you may accidentally get a shadow from the neighboring page if it's kind of moving or blocking in the line of where your light is. So that's just something while you're looking at the image you take that you're going to want to keep an eye out for. The obscured text, it mostly happens if you use something like a spatula to help you or a weight to help you hold things. Just keep an eye out that it doesn't actually bump over and cut off some of your text or images or something, because then you have to reshoot it. The last piece that we'll talk about for reflective material is oversized materials. These can be in any format that reflective materials can come in. So they might be large format photographic prints, large bound volumes. In the example on the slide, I'm working with one of my coworkers from NEDCC on some historic wallpaper. So these are usually the things that live in your flat files or your like big oversized boxes. And so the same rules apply for handling the reflective materials of whatever format they're in. So clean, dry hands. If it's mostly paper-based, if it's kind of more photographic materials, you're going to want those nitrile gloves. And this is most likely one of the more difficult formats to do in-house, just because you need a lot of space to move things around safely. You also kind of, depending on what quality you're looking to achieve, you may need special capture devices, and the techniques are usually a little trickier to hit those specifications. If you just want reference images, then I'm gonna tell you some DIY techniques that may help you do that. And then finally, the handling usually requires multiple people to make sure you can move it and handle it safely, which is why we're working together on this job in the picture. So as I mentioned, being in compliance with those FADI specifications becomes a lot more complicated with oversized materials. So we're gonna skip that for today. But what might a workflow look like? So if we are trying to capture these materials, you want to do it in-house, and maybe you're looking more for like, oh, I don't need it a certain resolution, I just want to make sure we can see it. And you have a couple of options. So you can image it from farther away and try to get it so you can see the whole thing in one picture. So get it all in one shot. You can also, if you want to have a little bit more detail, this is the little bit more tricky version, but it is possible. You can take multiple pictures all from the same height and then do what's called stitching, or is through editing. You can kind of put all those different pictures together like a puzzle um, into one picture. So the second approach is what we're doing in the picture on the slide. You'll notice there's little rectangles along the object that we're working on. Those are actually strips of magazine clippings because we use those as a tool to help us and more importantly, the computer software to put those pieces together for us. Because when you have especially like historic maps or documents, they usually are just a lot of tan background and don't always have a lot of very distinctive features. So those more illustrative magazine clippings can help the software know what it's looking at to put things back together. But for some of those DIY options that are a little bit simpler, what I would suggest is that you could place the materials on a clean, dry surface. Even the floor could be an option. If you do put it on the floor, I highly recommend that you put something under it. So usually, if it's a neutral background, that's usually better. So maybe a really extra large archival folder, archival board, just a clean kind of white sheet, something just to protect the object from the ground. Then you can just stand above the material to capture it. Try to hold your camera as level as possible and just make sure that nothing is going to fall on your materials while you're doing that. So if your camera has a strap, put it around your neck. And watch out for any shadows that might be cast by you or things around you while you're working. So now I mentioned that we were going to talk about two types of materials today. So we just talked about reflective and some of how that might look. So now we're going to move on to transmissive materials. So transmissive materials consist of items such as negatives, glass plate negatives, transparency slides, and this is material that light has to pass through in order to be viewed. So depending on your equipment, transmissive material may be something that you can do in-house. It is a bit more complicated to digitize than loose reflective materials, mostly just because there's more steps to do in kind of that processing or the post-production stage. You handle these materials similar to how you do any photographic materials. You're going to want to wear nitrile gloves while handling to keep the oils from your skin and your fingerprints off the materials. You also want to kind of handle it by those sides or those edges. Really try hard not to directly touch the center of the image if you can. You're also going to want to use extra caution with these when you're unpackaging them. Glass plates can sometimes be broken, so you'll want to know that before you're picking it up. And then deteriorating film can become very brittle and can be flaky. So you're going to kind of want to make sure you can see it before you're actually picking it up. If your film or your transmissive material needs an initial clean, I recommend that you remove that kind of loose dust and debris with that manual air blower, also sometimes called a rocket blower. As a general rule, we don't want to rub the surface of the film with a cloth or any kind of cleaners. Conservators know the special tools and treatments of how to do that, but for us on the everyday, I recommend that the rocket blower will hopefully get it good enough for what you need to do. We also, again, don't want to use compressed air because they can accidentally produce moisture, which we do not want near our materials. And finally, we are going to want to be aware of the emulsion side of our materials, especially for film. Glass plate negatives too, really any transmissive materials. So transmissive materials are made of layers of material and chemicals, which are able to be processed into the images that we then see. The part of the film that contains the photographic content or our image is called the emulsion. If you look at a piece of film in a lit room, you may notice that if you kind of pan it around, you may notice that one side looks really, really shiny and the other side looks more dull and may even appear to kind of have like lines or shapes on it. This dull side is called the emulsion side. So why do we care about the emulsion side of the film? Because we want to be consistent in how we place our material under or on our capture device while we digitize. So if we always put the emulsion side up, we want to do that the same every time. And if we always put it down, we want to do it the same every time. This is important because when we go to process our images after that post-production phase, we're going to want to make sure that our images are oriented correctly and that we don't have backwards letters and signs or pockets on wrong sides of people like that. We don't want to end up with like the mirror image of the real image. If you would like some advice of how you place it, it's often best to put the emulsion side towards your capture device so that the camera has the most direct view of that image information. Much like our example for loose reflective materials, this slide is showing the specifications that I chose to want to do at my institution for transmissive materials, as well as the dialog box from my scanner of how I could apply those. And in this example, I was shooting an 8x10" black and white negative. So I have chosen grayscale as my color mode to match my black and white negative. I chose a DPI of 2000 per the FADGI recommendations that I picked. And then my file format is that master TIFF file once again. And what might the workflow look like in this? Again, it's going to depend on your capture device. For me and my scanner, it was pretty similar to loose reflective materials since my scanner could do both. So we're going to make sure we start with that clean work surface. I have the folder to save everything in, know where it is, have it labeled so it makes sense with the materials we're working with. We're going to make sure our capture settings are in alignment with what we said in our documentation we want to do. Then we're going to place the material, take the picture, put the object, the physical object back where it belongs in its box or its envelope, and then kind of just eyeball to look for dust, dirt, reflections, weird things that we don't want that we know aren't part of the original object. A unique thing with transmissive materials is you can get this effect in the bottom picture. It's called moire. It's kind of like an optical illusion that happens where you get that weird rainbow or kind of ring pattern in your image. And it usually occurs for materials that have two very smooth surfaces, like glass and film, that are put next to each other. So this is something that we don't want in our images, and we're going to want to keep an eye out for. So let's review. We've somehow reached the end. Time always flies. So let's review what we talked about today. So we talked just a general review about what digitization is, what kind of files we're making, what you need to actually do it. We talked about priorities that we want to have and keep in mind while we're digitizing, no matter what the material type. So we want to keep our materials safe, preserve the context of those physical materials and the digital files we're making. We want to create as good of an image as we have the capability of creating. And we want to be consistent in our practices, which we're going to be able to do best through our documentation. And finally, we talked through some examples of handling, applying our specifications and workflows for the material formats that you might have in your collections. If you have a few parting thoughts before we move on, consider how much material you want to scan at a time. Remember that the more materials that you scan, there are more steps in the process, so you're going to have to do those too. So I suggest when you're just getting started that you start with a smaller batch of materials and go through your entire digitization process so you can test your workflow and test your documentation and then make tweaks if you need to. Hopefully this will let you kind of see how things work out and make those tweaks without having to redo a bunch of work. I also have a tool recommendation that is really handy for digitization, but also other kinds of work. You can get it's called a USB foot switch. I brought mine with me today. But what it does is you can plug it into your computer and you can program it to do either a certain keyboard shortcut or a string substitution. So what I do for digitization is I program it to whatever the keyboard shortcut is to actually capture an image. So then I have my hands free to handle materials, and I can trigger this with my foot on the floor to take the picture for me. You can also use it, like I said, any kind of repeatable task. If you have data entry you're doing and you're putting the same thing in the field every time, lots of cool things if you get creative. So I hope, as our time wraps up every time, I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed. But if you are doing great. Just remember to start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. There are a couple webinars left to round out the series. If you would like to register, links can be found in our monthly newsletter or on our website, nnyln.org. Or you can also scan the QR code on the next slide. So thank you for joining me today to learn about digital imaging. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I am happy to answer any questions that you have.